The sirens were already echoing down the street when I burst through my front door with my daughter in my arms. Her little body was shaking uncontrollably, lips turning blue, breath ragged and shallow. I could barely hold her steady in my arms, screaming at the dispatcher on speakerphone. The ambulance was less than a minute away. I could hear it. I could see it turning into our neighborhood. Relief surged through my chest, but then, like a scene from a nightmare, a silver Lexus swerved out of nowhere and blocked the narrow cul-de-sac. The ambulance screeched to a halt, and from the driver's side stepped out Karen. She didn't look panicked. She didn't ask if my daughter was okay. No. She folded her arms across her chest, stood her ground in the middle of the road, and said in a voice cold enough to freeze fire, "I told you. That wheelchair of hers keeps us up at night. This neighborhood has rules. Maybe this will finally teach you." My knees buckled. I screamed at her, begged her to move, to let the paramedics through, but she just stood there, watching my daughter seize in my arms, and said, "If she's so sick, maybe she shouldn't be living here in the first place." That's when I knew. This wasn't just petty HOA harassment. This was war. My disabled child, my only daughter, had been targeted by a woman so obsessed with quiet hours and property values that she was willing to risk a child's life. All because her wheelchair's motor made a faint hum when she went to the kitchen at night. That's what started it. One complaint, one letter, and it spiraled into a living hell. HOA notices, fines, neighbors turning against us, and now this. But what Karen didn't know, what no one in this nightmare neighborhood knew, was that I wasn't just some scared single mom. I had built my life clawing out of dirt and darkness. I knew how to fight, and I had kept quiet long enough. That night, while my daughter lay in the emergency room fighting for her life, I made a promise. Karen had declared war on the wrong woman, and I was going to burn her whole house of cruelty down, one HOA rule at a time. My name is Alana Torres. I'm a 36-year-old single mother, a registered nurse, and for the past 6 years, the only parent my daughter Emma has ever really known. Her father, Ethan, died in a car crash when she was just 2. He was hit by a drunk driver less than 2 miles from our old apartment. He'd been on his way home from the pharmacy, picking up medicine for Emma's fever. One moment, he was there. The next, I was standing in a hospital hallway, clutching a bag of prescriptions while a doctor explained what didn't make it really meant. From that day forward, every breath, every sleepless night, every overtime shift was for her. Everything I had left, I poured into making sure my little girl grew up safe, loved, and whole, no matter what. Emma was born with cerebral palsy. The doctors said she might never walk, and some days she struggles just to sit up on her own. But from the beginning, she defied every label, every expectation. Her wheelchair became her wings. She taught herself how to paint with her toes. She writes poetry using a voice-to-text app. And she has the brightest laugh you've ever heard, the kind that makes strangers in grocery stores smile. Every time I looked at her, I didn't see her disability. I saw her fire. Her strength made me strong. Even on days when I worked back-to-back 12-hour shifts and came home with aching feet, I'd walk into our apartment and find her singing to her cat or wheeling herself around making pretend tea for her stuffed animals. She never complained. Not once. She just lived with everything she had. But our old neighborhood was far from ideal. The elevator in our building broke down constantly. There were no ramps on the sidewalks. The neighbors weren't unkind, but they kept to themselves, and Emma was often lonely. So when I got the opportunity to transfer to a hospital on the west side and found a little single-story home in a gated community with wide streets, quiet parks, and a wheelchair-accessible layout, I jumped at it. It was everything we dreamed of. Clean, quiet, safe. I remember the day we moved in, Emma kept spinning in circles in her wheelchair and yelling, "We're fancy now, Mommy." That's when we met Karen. She was the first to introduce herself. Late 50s, perfect hair, clipboard in hand. She smiled too hard and asked too many questions. "Is your daughter okay to live alone like that?" she said, nodding toward Emma. I smiled politely and brushed it off. Maybe she meant well. Maybe it was just curiosity. But then came the rules. She explained the HOA regulations very strictly: noise levels, trash bins, parking positions. And when Emma giggled a little too loud from inside, she paused mid-sentence and frowned. "We just value our peace here," she added, like a warning hidden in a welcome. Still, I told myself to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just a little tightly wound. Maybe this was how rich neighborhoods worked. I didn't want to make waves, not after everything we'd survived just to get here. For the first few weeks, things seemed okay. We unpacked, decorated Emma's room with fairy lights and unicorn posters. She made drawings for the neighbors and left them in their mailboxes. I baked cookies and joined the community Facebook group. I wanted this to work. I needed this to work. But slowly, the red flags became harder to ignore. Karen started showing up unannounced, offering suggestions. She said Emma's wheelchair left marks on the sidewalk. She asked if I could keep the windows closed after 9 p.m. because the whirring sound disturbed her dog. One time, she even pointed at Emma's adaptive ramp and asked, "Is that permanent? Because it kind of disrupts the visual harmony of the street." That's when I started to feel it, that unease. Like we didn't really belong. Like behind every smile was a trapdoor. But I was used to pushing through. I'd fought through harder things than snobby neighbors and power-tripping HOA reps. I told myself we'd settle in eventually. I told myself Karen would back off once she realized Emma wasn't a problem. What I didn't realize was that Karen didn't see my daughter as a person at all. She saw her as a nuisance, a threat to her perfect little world. And she would stop at nothing to push us out. It started with a note, not even a proper letter, just a folded piece of printer paper taped crookedly to our front door. In all caps, bold black font, it read, "Please be considerate. The whirring from the wheelchair is disrupting neighbors' sleep. HOA quiet hours begin at 9 p.m. Thank you." There was no signature, no smiley face, just cold, blunt words and that unmistakable undertone of judgment. I remember holding the paper and staring at it for a full minute, trying to process what I was reading. Emma was inside, finishing her evening routine. She liked to wheel herself into the kitchen for a glass of milk and back again before bed. It was part of her independence, something we'd spent years working toward with physical therapy and emotional coaching. She'd beam with pride every time she managed it alone. And now, suddenly that small moment of joy, of freedom, was being turned into a nuisance. I tried to let it go. Maybe it wasn't meant maliciously. Maybe someone was just having a bad night. I tossed the note in the trash, tucked Emma in with her favorite pink blanket, and told her nothing. No need to worry her over something so silly. But the next day, an official HOA email landed in my inbox. Subject: Noise complaint, Unit 14B body. Multiple residents have reported unusual motorized noises between 9 to 10:30 p.m. Please ensure that all activity within your home complies with community quiet hour guidelines. Further disturbances may result in formal action. I felt my stomach twist. Unusual motorized noises? This wasn't a lawnmower or loud music. It was my daughter's wheelchair. A soft electric hum as she navigated her home, her own home. And now the entire community was being asked to weigh in on whether her existence was too loud. Still, I responded politely. I explained the nature of the sound, that my daughter used an electric wheelchair, and that we had always been respectful of community rules. I even offered to reduce evening movement as long as it didn't compromise her safety. No one replied. 2 days later, another note appeared, this time inside our mailbox and signed again. Maybe she should get a manual chair. Or maybe you should consider if this is the right place for her condition. I didn't tell Emma, not yet, but she could sense something. I wasn't smiling as much. I kept checking the windows, nervously. I lowered the volume on the TV, even when it was just the two of us. And then one night, I overheard her talking to her stuffed unicorn, whispering, "Maybe I'll stay in bed tomorrow, so no one gets mad." My heart broke. When I asked her why she'd say something like that, she looked up at me with those big brown eyes and said, "Because I don't want to get us in trouble, Mommy. I didn't mean to be noisy. I promise I didn't." That was the first time I cried in front of her in years. I reassured her, held her tightly, and promised that none of this was her fault. But inside, something started to harden. A resolve, a warning bell. We weren't just dealing with an annoying neighbor anymore. This was targeted, intentional, and it was escalating. At the next HOA meeting, I decided to attend. It was held in the community clubhouse where everyone sat in plastic chairs sipping coffee and pretending they weren't itching to get out of there. Karen, of course, sat near the front, clipboard in hand, eyes like daggers. When the floor opened for public comment, she stood and said, "I'd just like to raise a general concern about certain mechanical noises late at night. Our community was built for peace and relaxation, not hospital-grade equipment buzzing after hours." The word hospital hung in the air like a curse. I stood up and calmly said, "If you're referring to my daughter's wheelchair, perhaps you'd like to address me directly instead of hiding behind general statements." Karen smiled, unbothered. "Oh, I didn't name anyone." But if the shoe fits, murmurs rippled through the room. A few people looked uncomfortable. No one spoke up. After that night, the notes kept coming. One accusing Emma of disturbing pets, another claiming the wheelchair left unsightly tire marks on the community sidewalk. Someone even placed a noise meter outside our window and sent in a report claiming Emma's midnight trips to the bathroom breached 42 decibels. That was when Emma stopped going to the kitchen at night. She started refusing to roll around the house without asking me first. She asked to sleep in our old bed together again, something she hadn't done in years. I caught her looking at her wheelchair like it was a burden. I wanted to scream. I wanted to go door to door and make these people look at my daughter, truly see her. Not her wheels, not her sound, her smile, her fire, her innocence. But I knew that wouldn't change anything. Because for people like Karen, my daughter wasn't child. She was a problem. And problems needed to be silenced. At first, I thought it was just Karen. One bitter, miserable woman with too much free time and not enough kindness. I told myself that if I stayed respectful, patient, and quiet, this would pass, that the rest of the neighborhood couldn't possibly feel the same way. But I was wrong. Because the moment Karen sensed I wouldn't back down, she stopped working alone. She weaponized the very thing I had admired about the neighborhood, its order, its togetherness, its structure. She turned the HOA into her army. It began subtly. The HOA sent a warning email stating that all outdoor items not visually approved by the board had to be removed within 48 hours, including temporary structures and protrusions. That protrusion was the wheelchair ramp I had installed at our front door after filling out the proper paperwork and getting written approval. But suddenly, they said there had been a reevaluation of visual uniformity standards. My ramp, the same one that let my daughter enter her home, was now non-compliant. I called, emailed, pleaded, no response. Karen, of course, was the newly appointed aesthetic chair for the HOA. Then came the playground rule change. A new regulation was quietly posted in the community newsletter. Children under 16 with mobility devices must be accompanied by a guardian when on HOA property. It was written like a safety precaution, but the intent was crystal clear. Emma was 11 and one of the only kids in the neighborhood who used a wheelchair. She had loved going to the community playground after school, drawing chalk art on the sidewalk, and watching the other kids play. Now, unless I was with her every second, which was impossible with my work schedule, she wasn't allowed. Emma didn't cry. She just got very quiet. One afternoon, I found her trying to lift her wheelchair up the curb to avoid using the ramp. When I asked her why, she looked up with those sad, exhausted eyes and said, "Because maybe if I don't use the ramp, they won't be mad anymore." It was happening. The thing every mother fears. Not just bullying, but erasure. Emma was being taught by adults that her existence was inconvenient, that her independence, her movement, her joy were things to be minimized. And the worst part? It was all happening under the polished smile of neighborhood regulations. Then came the pool incident. It was early June, and the community pool had finally opened. Emma was so excited. She had her new water-safe chair, a little sun hat, and had spent days talking about how she wanted to go swimming like normal kids. I got the afternoon off work and rolled her down in the sunshine. She was practically glowing. But at the entrance gate, we were stopped by a young man I didn't recognize, probably one of Karen's recruits. He looked down at a clipboard and said, "You're Torres, right? Unit 14B?" I nodded, confused. "I'm sorry, but this chair's wheels don't meet our sanitation standards. Water contamination risk. You'll need to submit a pool-safe certification form before she can enter." "What?" I said, stunned. "This is a medical-grade chair. It's brand new. It's made for water access. This is ADA compliant." He cut me off. "Those are the rules now. You can appeal it at the next HOA meeting." Emma was silent. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. I wheeled her home in silence. That night, she didn't eat dinner. She just sat in her room staring at the blank canvas on her art easel. The next HOA meeting was worse. I came prepared: documents, ADA guidelines, photos, emails. I wasn't going to be steamrolled again. I stood up when the floor opened for member grievances and began calmly presenting my case. But Karen interrupted. "Ms. Torres," she said sweetly, "perhaps your energy would be better spent looking for a more appropriate living arrangement for your daughter. We all sympathize, truly. But this community has standards, and it's unfair to ask everyone to bend around your situation." I looked around the room, expecting someone, anyone, to speak up. No one did. Some looked away. Others nodded. A few crossed their arms like I was the problem for bringing drama into their precious monthly meeting. That was the moment the isolation truly set in. I realized we were alone. Completely. The same neighbors who waved when we first moved in now crossed the street when they saw me coming. Emma's chalk drawings outside vanished overnight. Her little welcome sign, the one with painted hearts, was torn down and thrown in the trash. The Facebook group, which I used to check for community events, had quietly removed me. And then the final straw. It was a hot, sticky Friday night. Emma wasn't feeling well. Her breathing was shallow, her muscles tense. I gave her her meds, checked her vitals, and decided it was time to call 911. We'd been through these episodes before, and every minute mattered. I carried her to the porch, phone in one hand, holding her in the other, waiting for the ambulance. I heard the sirens getting closer and rushed to the edge of the driveway to flag them down. But just before they turned onto our street, Karen's silver Lexus pulled out of her driveway and stopped directly in the middle of the road. She got out slowly like she had all the time in the world and walked over to my driveway. "What's going on?" she asked, casually glancing at Emma in my arms. "Is she having one of her episodes again?" I didn't answer. I screamed for her to move her car. "You're blocking the ambulance." She looked back toward the flashing lights approaching and said, "They'll figure it out. They can park up the street." "You're making a scene again, Alana." The ambulance had to park nearly 100 yards away. The EMTs sprinted down the block, pushing a stretcher. Precious minutes were lost. My daughter's life was on the line. And Karen? She just stood there, arms crossed, watching, as if she had won something. That night, after the chaos, after the ER visit, after I tucked my daughter into her hospital bed and kissed her forehead, I stepped outside and sat alone on a bench near the parking lot. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage. Karen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She hadn't just harassed US. She had endangered my child. And now she was going to learn I wasn't just a nurse. I wasn't just a mother. I was a fighter. And I was done playing by her rules. The ambulance ride was a blur. Emma was in and out of consciousness, her tiny hand limp in mine, her breathing shallow and irregular. The paramedics worked quickly, administering oxygen, placing sensors on her chest, whispering terms I'd heard 1,000 times before in ER, terms that sounded far more terrifying when it was my own daughter lying there instead of someone else's. I kept thinking, what if she hadn't made it? What if the delay? What if that woman? The thought made my stomach churn. We spent 6 hours in the hospital that night. Emma was diagnosed with respiratory distress brought on by a muscle spasm that compressed her lungs, something that could have been fatal had she gone without treatment even 10 minutes longer. The doctor told me we were lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt angry. When Emma finally stabilized and drifted to sleep in the sterile glow of the hospital room, I stepped outside. It was 3:17 a.m. I sat on a cold metal bench near the emergency entrance, still in my scrubs, dried blood on my arm from where Emma had bitten down in pain during the episode. My head was pounding. My heart was hollow. And I cried. I sobbed like a child, loud, broken, and uncontrollable. The kind of crying I hadn't done since the day Ethan died. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't just fear. It was rage. It was despair. It was the terrifying realization that I had allowed these people, this woman, to chip away at my daughter's joy, her safety, her right to exist. I had played polite. I had written emails and filed complaints. I had held my tongue and kept my head down. And in doing so, I had given Karen permission to hurt us. But not anymore. Because as I sat on that bench, shaking and soaked in sweat and tears, something inside me shifted. I remembered who I was. Not just a nurse. Not just a mother. But a woman who had survived the worst this world could throw at her and still stood tall. I had buried my husband and raised a disabled daughter on my own. I had worked 16-hour shifts to pay for therapy, education, and hospital bills. I had sacrificed everything for Emma, and I would burn the world down before I let one smug HOA queen endanger her life again. I wiped my face, pulled out my phone, and began documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every voicemail. Every time Karen had harassed us, blocked the ramp, stood in the street. I took photos of the notes, the denied ramp citation, the fake noise complaints. I pulled security camera footage of her blocking the ambulance. I started a folder and labeled it in all caps, war file. But this wasn't going to be a petty fight. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Because Emma wasn't the only child with special needs in this world. And if this could happen to her in a neighborhood that claimed to be inclusive and progressive, then how many others were suffering in silence? I wasn't just going to fight for us. I was going to expose the system. That week, I contacted a disability rights attorney I knew from the hospital, a woman named Carla who had dedicated her life to ADA violations and advocacy. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she said only 2 words. Let's begin. I also called a local news anchor who had once interviewed me during a charity hospital drive. I sent her the footage, the documents, the reports. Her silence only lasted a day. And then she called me back and said, "We're running this." By the end of the week, there was a story brewing. Not just about a cruel HOA, but about a community that had turned a blind eye to ableism, that had empowered a woman to endanger a child's life in the name of quiet hours. Karen didn't know it yet, but her reign was crumbling. The next time I rolled Emma down our driveway, proudly, visibly, her wheelchair humming like it always had, I didn't care who heard. I wanted them to hear. I wanted them to look. Because we were done hiding. We were done apologizing for existing. And when Karen stepped outside that morning, wearing her usual cardigan and superiority, I looked her dead in the eye. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, I said calmly, "Your silence almost killed my daughter. This time, it's your turn to be quiet." Her mouth snapped shut, and for the first time since we moved in, Karen took a step back. Because she saw it in my face, the fire, the steel, she had finally met the real me, and I wasn't afraid anymore. The first thing I did was buy a second phone. Not for calls or texts, but for proof. Every HOA meeting, every doorstep conversation, every whispered insult Karen thought no one heard. I recorded it all. I stopped trying to be the pleasant neighbor. I stopped smiling at passive-aggressive comments. I stopped hoping for fairness from a group of people who had already decided my daughter was disposable. And instead, I documented every instance of harassment like a general preparing for war. I attended every single HOA meeting and sat in the front row. When they brought up noise levels or community standards, I hit record. When they made sly, coded comments about mechanical disruptions or individuals requiring special care, I took names. I asked questions. Can you clarify what you mean by disruptions? Are you referring to mobility aids? I forced them to answer out loud. I wanted them to get used to hearing their bigotry in their own voices. And I wasn't alone anymore. 2 days after Karen blocked the ambulance, I met Carol. She lived 5 houses down, a widow with a disabled brother who had passed away a few years ago. She'd seen everything from her front window that night. She'd called 911 herself. I've kept quiet long enough, she told me, handing me a printed statement she'd written up. Use this however you need. That night, it hit me. Karen's power came from everyone else's silence. But now the silence was cracking. So I knocked on doors. I had coffee with neighbors who looked away at meetings. I asked the teenage boy across the street if he remembered what time the ambulance was blocked. I interviewed an older couple who'd always waved at Emma and kept their heads down. They were scared at first, afraid of retaliation, of being fined for weeds in their lawn or having the wrong blinds. But slowly they opened up. I promised to protect them. I promised them I wasn't backing down. I wasn't bluffing. While Karen and her HOA cronies played checkers, I had already moved on to chess. My secret weapon? A friend from the hospital. Carla Diaz, a brilliant civil rights attorney who specialized in ADA Americans with Disabilities Act enforcement. When I told her what was happening, she didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't ask if I had proof. She asked, "How big do you want to go?" National, I said. We filed the lawsuit the next week. Torres versus Harper Creek HOA, citing multiple violations of the Fair Housing Act, ADA regulations, and emotional endangerment of a minor with disabilities. We included affidavits from witnesses, video and audio recordings, HOA emails that used quality of life as a justification to limit my daughter's access to community spaces, and, of course, security footage of Karen blocking the ambulance. But I didn't stop at the legal system. I contacted a local journalist I had once helped during a hospital fundraiser, Jessica Lynn, a tenacious investigative reporter with a soft spot for medical injustice. I sent her everything. Within 3 days, the story was on the local news under the headline, HOA blocks ambulance, disabled girl hospitalized after neighbor interference. Within a week, it spread to regional media. Then national outlets picked it up. Disability rights advocates began sharing it online. A viral post on Twitter featured Emma's smiling photo beside the words, "She was just trying to go to the kitchen." It was retweeted 80,000 times in 2 days. That was when the pressure cooker burst. The Harper Creek HOA was flooded with emails, calls, letters. National disability organizations sent cease and desist warnings. News crews camped outside the front gate. Someone found Karen's real estate license online and posted screenshots of her equal housing opportunity clause with the caption, "Unless your child needs wheels, apparently." The HOA board, once untouchable and smug, was now spinning in panic. I was called in for an emergency mediation. They wanted to settle. They wanted to make it go away. They offered to waive my fines, repaint the ramp, and write a public apology. I laughed. "You endangered my daughter's life," I said. "You silenced her, mocked her, and treated her like a pest. Do you think this is about paint and PR?" I walked out. This wasn't just about my daughter anymore. This was for every child told to be quiet, for every parent too scared to speak, for every family forced to move out in the dead of night because their child made people uncomfortable. Carla was ecstatic. "They blinked first," she said. "Now we finish it." We pushed forward with the lawsuit and filed a parallel complaint with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. We had the attention now, and I knew something had shifted permanently when a U.S. Senator tweeted a response to our story with the words, "The ADA is not optional. It's the law, and it protects kids like Emma." Karen, once the queen of the cul-de-sac, stopped showing up to HOA meetings. Her Lexus was egged one night. She filed a complaint with the police. Irony, it seems, is not lost on fate. But I never encouraged revenge. I didn't want her car keyed or her mailbox vandalized. I wanted her held accountable the right way, in front of the world. The same week, the national news ran a segment titled The Wheels of Justice. One mother's fight against HOA discrimination. I received an email from a family in Arizona. They had a son with muscular dystrophy. Their HOA had just denied them a ramp. They wrote, "Because of you, we're not afraid to fight anymore." That's when I knew. I had already won. The lawsuit would continue. The board would crumble. The media storm would eventually fade. But the movement had begun. Emma's wheelchair never made me feel helpless again. It made me proud. And Karen? She didn't know it yet, but she had helped awaken something much bigger than she could ever control. She tried to silence a child with wheels. And now the world was listening. The public hearing was standing room only. Local reporters lined the back wall, cameras aimed at the front table where the Harper Creek HOA board members sat, sweating through their suits. Karen was there too, flushed, rigid, her lips pursed so tightly they disappeared into her face. She didn't look like the powerful woman who used to march up and down the sidewalks with her clipboard, issuing warnings like a queen patrolling her kingdom. She looked cornered, exposed. I sat with Emma at my side, her small hand wrapped around mine, her chair polished and gleaming. Her nails were painted pink with tiny white flowers, courtesy of our neighbor Carol, who had insisted Emma get pampered before her big day. Carol was here, too, seated right behind us with a tissue bowl in her hand. So were the Rivers family the boy from across the street, and half a dozen others who had once looked the other way, but were now here, silent but standing. The meeting was opened by the City Council's ADA compliance officer who had reviewed our case following the national outcry. He spoke in a calm, stern voice, laying out the facts, the ramp denial, the noise complaints, the pool restrictions, the ambulance incident, the deliberate pattern of exclusion and endangerment of a disabled minor. When he played the footage, the one from my security camera showing Karen blocking the ambulance while I screamed for her to move, the room fell dead silent. And then the gasps, not just from the public, but from the HOA board members themselves. One of them, a man who had always seemed indifferent, stood up mid-meeting and said, "I had no idea it went this far. I'm resigning. Effective immediately." He walked out without another word. Karen looked around, as if suddenly realizing she was alone. Then it was my turn. I stood up, holding the microphone with steady hands and a calm voice. I told them about my daughter, her strength, her joy, her desire to live a normal life. I told them how we had tried to belong, to follow every rule, to exist without disrupting anyone's peace, and how we had been met not with kindness, but with cruelty, with bureaucracy dressed as policy, with silence that was just as loud as hate. Then I said, my daughter's wheelchair makes noise. So does injustice. And it should. Applause broke out. Some people stood. One woman behind the cameras wiped her eyes. The decision was swift and public. The HOA was fined $250,000 in federal penalties for ADA violations. The neighborhood was ordered to undergo mandatory sensitivity and ADA compliance training. The ramp removal demand was permanently voided, and a city-certified ramp, designed by a local accessibility architect, was installed at no cost to us. Karen? She was voted out unanimously as HOA chair. Her real estate license was flagged for ethical violations, and she was barred from serving on any community board again anywhere in the state. But the most powerful moment came a week later. I was sitting on my porch with Emma, sipping lemonade in the summer heat when we heard the sound of hammers and drills. I turned to look and saw our neighbors, Carol, the Rivers family, and even the teenage boy, working together to build a new ramp on the far end of the playground, a place Emma hadn't been allowed to go alone in months. They didn't ask for recognition. They didn't announce it. They just built it. For her. Emma looked up at me and smiled, the kind of smile that starts in the eyes and travels all the way through your soul. "They made it for me," she whispered. I nodded. "They finally see you." She wheeled down the sidewalk toward the new ramp, her laughter ringing through the air like music. No one stopped her. No one complained. For the first time since we moved in, she was free. And me? I sat back and watched my daughter fly, not in spite of her wheels, but because of them. Karen tried to bury her, but she didn't know you can't bury light. It shines through everything. The air was quiet, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It wasn't the cold, watchful silence that had haunted us for months. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes room for laughter, for healing. Emma was outside, wheeling herself across the lawn, her hair blowing in a breeze. She'd painted the spokes of her wheelchair bright yellow, saying it reminded her of sunshine. She was chasing bubbles, popping them with her fingertips and laughing so hard she nearly tipped herself over. I watched her from the porch, heart full, eyes wet. For once, no one was watching her with judgment. No one was whispering behind drawn curtains or reporting noise to the HOA. The Karen era was over, and in its place, something new had started to grow: acceptance, community, even friendship. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see Mr. Davidson, the elderly man who lived across the street, always trimming his roses, always looking away during the worst moments. He held his hat in his hands like a nervous schoolboy. I just wanted to say, he began, voice trembling, I should have spoken up sooner. I knew what they were doing wasn't right. I didn't know how to help. I didn't yell. I didn't scold. I just nodded and said, "You help by being here now." He looked over at Emma and smiled. She's stronger than all of us put together. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she whispered, "Mommy, I'm glad we stayed. I like it here now." And I realized something profound. We hadn't just survived this place. We had changed it. We weren't the disruption. We were the wake-up call. My daughter wasn't the one who needed to be silenced. She was the one who needed to be heard. As I stood in the doorway, watching her drift off to sleep, I whispered into the quiet, "You were never the problem, baby. You were the voice this place needed." And this time, the silence that answered me was full of peace. Just when I thought it was over, when the ramp was rebuilt and Emma was finally safe, another letter arrived. A different neighborhood, a different HOA, but the same cold words. "Your presence disrupts the harmony of our community." Only this time, it wasn't about Emma. It was about me. In our next episode on the HOA stories, I'll tell you what happened when I tried to start fresh and found myself targeted all over again, this time for something I couldn't hide. If you've ever felt powerless, silenced, or pushed out by the people meant to protect you, this channel is for you. These stories are your stories. Collision, subscribe now to the HOA stories for more real-life battles, emotional justice, and HOA nightmares that will leave you speechless. And if you have a story to tell, drop it in the comments. You are not alone. We fight back together.